specialist with the Woodlands Township Environmental Services. So really, we just kind of want to give an overview of what a watershed is and talk a little bit about water quality and how you can get involved. So I did just spoil my overview slide. I guess kind of the three main questions that we want to answer today are: what is a watershed? What is water quality and what affects it? And then how can we, as people who live and work and play in the watershed, how can we take action to improve water quality? So we'll start at the beginning talking about what a watershed actually is. So this may be kind of beginner stuff, but I just wanted to make sure we covered a broad audience here. So a watershed is really an area of land that drains to a common waterway. So as an example here, on the right side of the screen, we have a map that shows this dark blue area. So this isn't county boundaries or city boundaries or anything. This is an area of land that catches water and all drains to the same place. So in this case, it all drains to Galveston Bay. This is the lower Galveston Bay watershed, all represented in blue. So any drop of water that falls within this land area is likely to end up in one of these waterways and ultimately drain into Galveston Bay. So that is what a watershed is. And a watershed area can vary in scale depending on the terminal water body that you're interested in. So if we're talking about Galveston Bay, we're talking about this whole watershed area. And in fact, I think the watershed area for Galveston Bay even goes further up towards the Dallas area if you consider the whole track of the Trinity River, which also drains into Galveston Bay. But you can also have very small watershed areas. Let's say we're focused on, we just want to know what's going on in, say, like Armand Bayou, which is a much smaller water body. That's going to have a much smaller watershed area that all drains to the same place. So what I really want to drive home with this concept of watersheds is that what happens on the land has the potential to affect what happens in our waterways. And these watershed areas really connect some kind of broad and diverse communities that all ultimately might impact the same terminal water body. So just to kind of bring it back home and talk about more focus on the actual Woodlands Township, let's kind of zoom in a little bit. So we still have our dark blue lower Galveston Bay watershed area. And now we're looking specifically at the San Jacinto River Basin. So all of these lighter, greener colors represent sub-watersheds within the San Jacinto River Basin. And we have Woodlands right in the center of that. And if we zoom in again, and we look at just kind of the neighboring watersheds around the Woodlands Township boundary, we can see the Lake Creek watershed area, West Fork San Jacinto River. Spring Creek is really where the majority of the Woodlands area boundary falls. And then we have Cypress Creek just to the south of that. And all of these sub-watersheds drain into Lake Houston, which is a very important drinking water resource for the region. So we're especially concerned with any impacts that might be observed in these watersheds and how they might affect our drinking water resource. So let's zoom in one more time. This next level is very busy, but just to kind of drive home that idea of scale and how focused a watershed can be if you're just looking at a particular water body. So let's look at the Woodlands proper here in this kind of yellow golden color outline. And we can see, you know, many sub-watersheds that overlap with the Woodlands area. But really the ones I want to draw to your attention are Spring Creek running through kind of the southern portion of the Woodlands Township. Bear Branch and Panther Branch are going to be two other really important water bodies in this area. So we'll talk a little bit more about those specific water bodies a little bit later in the presentation, but that's just to kind of give an overview of watersheds. So before we go further, does anybody have any quick questions before we talk about water quality? Are we good to go? All right, hearing none, I'll go ahead and move on. So let's talk about water quality and why water resources are important to us. And I think these are kind of no-brainers. Of course, healthy water resources support our economy, they improve the quality of our lives, and they sustain a diverse ecology that we can all enjoy. And I'm not just going to sit here and read the bullets on the slide to you, but there are a lot of diverse ways in which we use water resources in our daily lives, not least of which is just um, enjoying that kind of aesthetic value, getting that kind of quality of life from being near a really great water body, such as those seen in the Spring Creek Watershed. So that's why we care about water quality in this watershed. So now let's talk about some of the threats to water quality, or some of the things that can impact water quality. So when we're talking about pollutants and contaminants, we're usually talking about two main categories of these pollutant sources. So we have point sources, also called end of pipe sources. So if we're talking about, say, wastewater outfall, that we can identify readily, that at that outfall site, there's a contamination issue. We can trace that back to the facility and take action that way. But what's a little bit trickier are some of these non-point sources of pollution, where they enter the waterways usually through runoff. So there's no particular way to trace it back to the exact source, but we know generally what other sources of pollution are impacting our waterways. So one of the big factors that we're concerned about in the Woodlands area, but also the greater Houston area, the greater region throughout the state, et cetera, is this problem of fecal waste in our waterways. So it's a really common issue that fecal waste from human sources, pet waste, agriculture, wildlife, invasive species is ending up in our waterways in concentrations great enough that we would discourage contact recreation. So that's really what we're trying to get in front of here, is improving water quality enough that those activities can be safe again, such as, wading in the water and things like that. So some other contaminants that we might worry about are contaminants from lawns and fertilizers, and anything that might be on the surface of things like trash and litter in our waterways, and illegal dumping that happens as well. So the effects of these kind of pollution events are obviously impacts to human health and aquatic life, and that can also lead to increased nutrient concentrations and low levels of oxygen, which can be pretty harmful to the ecosystem of the waterway. So that's what we're trying to get ahead of when we talk about getting involved in improving water quality in our local watersheds. So some other challenges, obviously growth in this region. The Houston area, greater Houston area, the region is expected to grow in population by 4 million by the year 2045. And with that, we're going to see a lot of increased suburban development. So development is not a good or a bad thing. It's just part of our reality that we have to kind of adapt into our strategies when we're thinking about the future of the watersheds that we're going to be working in. How are these development projects going to impact the way that we try to improve water quality in the watershed? How do we work with that in the future? Because it is just part of our reality in the Houston area. So when we have these increases in suburban areas, we're going to see changes to the landscape that alter the way that the land interacts with water. So this is going to increase impervious surface area. It's going to lead to more sheet flow, or less filtration into the natural earth. And this is going to kind of mess with the dynamics of stormwater as we see more developed areas in our watersheds. So that's just something that we have to think about and take account of when we're thinking about how we want to improve water quality in our watershed areas. So how do we decide which water bodies are okay, which ones are safe, which ones need help? We do this through regular water quality monitoring. So in the state of Texas, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality keeps a record of the water quality in each of the water bodies throughout the state. And these data are delivered to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality by teams of researchers who are out there regularly monitoring the waterways for things like bacteria levels, nutrient levels, dissolved oxygen, and other factors. So each one of these kind of parameters of interest, a lot of them have different criteria for what is allowable in a waterway to have it still be appropriate for different types of use. So there may be different standards for the same parameter just based on what that waterway is being used for. In particular, especially with the Spring Creek Watershed Protection Plan project that we made reference to, we're concerned about improving the waterways enough that they're safe for contact recreation. And so we're looking specifically in that case at bacteria levels and how that might affect the safety of the waterway. And by doing this, by having this regular record of monitoring stations throughout all these different water bodies throughout the state, we can identify which water bodies are in need of improvement by comparing the levels of observed parameters in the waterway against the actual standards that say this is, the safe level, and this is where we actually need to take action. So in the Spring Creek watershed in particular, I say that, but really these are pretty common issues, again, throughout the region. But for Spring Creek, some of the impairments and concerns in our water bodies that we're worried about are high levels of fecal indicator bacteria, high levels of nutrients, and low levels of dissolved oxygen. So we'll talk a little bit more about the watershed planning process, but particularly with the way that the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership has been thinking about improving water quality in this watershed is by also considering additional challenges that are not necessarily water quality issues. They're a little bit adjacent to water quality, let's say, such as issues with sedimentation, changing the flow of the waterway, trash and litter in the waterways, and also flooding. So we can kind of keep those parallel concepts in mind when we're thinking about water quality improvement strategies that we want to enact down the line. So more specifically, so if you'll remember a few slides ago, we looked at that very busy map with lots of very small sub-watersheds around the Woodlands Township boundary. And remember, I called to your attention specifically Spring Creek, Upper and Lower Panther Branch, and Bear Branch as kind of the main waterways that run through the township. So I've represented some of our water quality data here for you guys to kind of see where each one of these water bodies falls in comparison to our criteria for what is safe in these waterways. And I promise these are the only numbers that I'm going to show you. I don't know what Teri has, but this is all that I'm going to show you in terms of math and numbers. But what we really want to point out here is anytime we had a parameter exceed the allowable criteria, I went ahead and highlighted that in red. So we see that in Spring Creek, we do have an issue with bacteria. It's about twice the level of the standard. And we also have a problem in Bear Branch. It's not quite as severe, but we're looking at a geomean average of bacteria measurements on these different water bodies collected between the year 2016 and the present day. So roughly 6-7 years of data, which is kind of comparable to the way TCEQ looks at data, or the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality looks at data in our water bodies. Is kind of on this 7-year interval that they move on a 2-year incremental basis. And if you're interested in looking at more of those numbers, they can be found in integrated reports that are put out by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality every 2 years. So the most recent one that they put out was in 2020, but we should be looking at a 2022 version of that in the near future. So this just kind of gives you a snapshot of what's been happening in the watershed for the past 6 or 7 years in terms of bacteria, dissolved oxygen, and some of the nutrients of concern that we always look at when we're monitoring these waterways. So in addition to bacteria, we do see that total phosphorus was also exceeding the standard in Upper Panther Branch. But other than that, we do have compliance, at least on a geomean basis, with a lot of these parameters. So that just kind of gives you a snapshot of what's going on specifically in the Woodlands Township. So when I talk more about water quality improvement strategies, especially as they pertain to the work being done by the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership, a lot of those strategies are going to really focus in on how to reduce this bacteria in the waterway But the good news about that is that a lot of the strategies that we can put in place to do that also have positive benefits in reducing nutrient concentrations and improving dissolved oxygen levels, which are actually fine in the Woodlands Township area. So that's kind of the background on water quality. So I'll pause again in case anyone has questions before we really get to talking about how we want to move forward with implementing some of these water quality improvement strategies. I do see a chat that says, does your team check quality in lakes, ponds in the woodlands, Lake Woodlands, Bear Branch Reservoir, Shadow Lake, and any of the neighborhood ponds? So we do have monitoring data for lake woodlands, but the monitoring that's done for reservoirs is a little bit different from our stream monitoring. So we have that data, and usually what we see in the reservoir areas is it's kind of harder to track water quality because they're still water bodies. So I can't think of the numbers right off the top of my head, but yes, we do have teams out there monitoring those water bodies as well.
Yeah, they're different in that there's no, like you said, no flow usually, or it may be there for weeks and weeks and weeks before it rains, etc. So it's a little harder to judge.
Right.
I would like, before you go, just on the phosphorus, I'm assuming that's fertilizers and things like that. Well, whatever it is, can you go into what phosphorus and why it would be high, and the detriment that it has, I guess, is a nutrient to some of the things that might utilize oxygen a little faster than we'd like it?
Right. So total phosphorus would be another one of those non-point source pollutants that could come from a variety of sources, including fertilizers and things like that. But the real concern with high levels of nutrients in the water is that can spike, algae blooms that can be detrimental to other species living in the waterway. It can cause fish kills and ultimately deplete the oxygen in that waterway, leading to low levels of dissolved oxygen. So we try and and regulate that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. I see another question in the chat. Is the bacteria implementation group still involved in implementing strategies to reduce bacteria load in our waterways? Yes. So that's also a program that the Houston Galveston Area Council helps to coordinate, and we're still very involved. And that's a much larger area that we're looking at. So the benefit of the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership is we can kind of hone down to specific issues affecting areas around Spring Creek. So Woodlands Township included for sure. Cool. Well, see no more action in the chat. So I'll go ahead and move on to talking about how we can take action. So there are lots of different angles for coming at improving water quality. So we'll start at kind of looking at the state and federal level, and then what we can do as individuals at the local level. So at the state and federal level, the main function of those entities is to regulate sources such as wastewater wherever they can. So if there is a problem with an outfall coming directly into a waterway that's in violation of the criteria that are deemed safe for that waterway, then the state and federal agencies can take action and enforce the criteria to be correct in that waterway by whatever means. So maybe that facility might need to improve their infrastructure. And in some cases, what can happen is fines that are incurred from these violations can actually fund remediation and mitigation efforts. So that's a cool program. I'm thinking specifically of the supplemental environmental program, where violation or fees incurred from violations can be redirected to homeowners who might need a little assistance in repairing or replacing their on-site sewage facilities or aerobic septic systems. So that is something that the Houston-Galveston Area Council helps to coordinate. So whenever, let's say, the county gets some of those monies in fines, then the Houston-Galveston Area Council can help redistribute those to residents in the watershed. And I foolishly did not include a link or anything, but if anybody wants more information on that program, please get in touch with me. There is quite a long waiting list, and the progress is a little bit slow, so we only get to a few properties per year, but that is a really great program that I'd love to get you connected with if you're interested. So at the local level, we have local governmental efforts, obviously, and we have community activism, which I'm hoping that Teri will explain in more detail. I still have a couple more slides, but Teri's doing some really great work in kind of coordinating the community, especially in the Woodlands Township. And there are also watershed-based plans, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the following slides. So watershed-based plans include total maximum daily load implementation plans, which are a little bit more focused on a particular contaminant of concern. Usually they focus on one at a time, such as bacteria or DO, dissolved oxygen. Whereas the kind of alternative to that is a watershed protection plan, which can have a little bit more of a broad scope, and it's a more voluntary process. So let's talk a little bit more about watershed protection plans. That is kind of the route that we've decided to go with in the Spring Creek watershed, is to develop a watershed protection plan versus a total maximum daily load implementation plan. And the cool things about these plans are that they're community led. Like I said, they're voluntary, non-regulatory documents. So the community will come together, people who live and work and play in the watershed will kind of discuss the watershed issues and how to go about them in a way that's best for that particular geographical area. So it's really focused down on, a particular watershed at a time. And all of these plans are data-based. So like I said, we have all this great resource in the monitoring work that's done regularly throughout the state that we can reference. So we know exactly what's going on in the watershed, and we can use that data to enhance these plans. And of course, the local knowledge is really important to making sure that the data that we have matches what people are actually observing in the watershed on a daily basis. And another great thing about these watershed protection plans is that they're built to be adaptable. So if we decide maybe 5 years down the line, looking back at our plan and looking at our progress and implementation, that some things need reworking or kind of adjusting, then that's possible to do with a watershed protection plan. It's meant to be more of like a living document that responds in real time to what the watershed needs. So talk a little bit more about the Spring Creek Watershed Partnership. These partnership meetings were held from July 2020 to August 2021. I'm thinking that it might be time to have another one, even though this contract period is closed. It might just be good to touch base with the partnership again and explain where we are in the process. So during those meetings from July 2020 to August 21, the partnership kind of worked with different models looking at some of these parameters in the waterway, where some of these parameters were of most concern throughout the watershed, what potential sources were leading to those contamination issues, so that we could really tailor the watershed protection plan to target those specific issues. So like I said, the partnership developed the best strategies for improvement and into the Spring Creek Watershed Protection Plan. And so that draft document was sent to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality back in August of last year after our last stakeholder meeting, which incorporated all the edits that our stakeholders had, the partnership had. So then we delivered it to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and it's been in the review process ever since then. But I'm happy to report that we finally, just in time for this meeting, got our edits back on that watershed protection plan yesterday. So I am currently in the process of incorporating the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality edits so that we can hopefully get that document sent to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, for final approval. And then we can really start taking action and implementing some of the plans that are in this document. And as another little piece of news that I'm really excited about, and I'm going to try and talk very generally about it because it's still in the development phase, but last year, 2021, the Houston Galveston Area Council submitted a proposal to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality to actually get some implementation dollars at work in the Spring Creek watershed, as well as some of the neighboring watersheds like Cypress Creek to the south and Lake Creek and West Fork San Jacinto River just north of Spring Creek. So all those West Lake Houston watersheds, H-GAC asked for some money to be able to actually implement some of the plans that have been developed in those watersheds, and that was approved. So we're in the contract development process. We still don't have any kind of hard details on that yet, but we're excited to continue moving on from the planning stage into the actual implementation stage in this watershed. So that's some good news that I wanted to share. And as for getting involved, this is kind of where I'm going to pass it over to Teri. So just generally, growing support for regional planning starts at the local level. So what we really need volunteer help with is building awareness, actually getting out in the watershed and implementing some of these strategies, become an ambassador, and take personal action. So things that you can do at the household level, things that you can do with your community. These are really impactful ways of improving water quality in a watershed. So at this point, I will stop again and pass it over to Teri. I think I'll go ahead and stop my share.
So much. That just perfect. I think people have a good understanding of the partnership and what the issues are. I think that we that live in the Woodlands and fortunate enough to take the paths I mentioned in our notice, that we have the Spring Creek Greenway, we have
Yes.
the Mitchell Preserve, we have all these things, but it's kind of alarming to find that water that runs through those, that ones we're walking by, are not quite what they should be. And I think that's what our goal is to fix that, make it something that we can be proud of as well. So Teri, and again, appreciate it. I hope you'll hang around a little bit but Teri, I've known Teri for a long time, and I will just say that between her job, real job, and her volunteerism and her just being an advocate for this environment, I think it appears to me she works about 8 days a week. And
say that's accurate.
and I just appreciate it so much, that she works for the Woodlands Township. She's in the environmental group there. Again, that's her job, but then there's so much more that she does to make sure that we have the volunteers reach out to the volunteers to explain the problem and solicit their help. And so I've asked her to come and talk about the things that she's done and the Woodlands Township has done in the environmental services section to address this issue, not waiting on anything except the fact that there's a problem. And so I've asked her to go through some of the things that they have done in the last few years to address the quality of Spring Creek. So go ahead.
Thanks, Paul.
Teri.
And thank you, Rachel, for that great information and that wonderful news. So I'm so excited. Can't wait to hear the details as you get them. So this is a community, as all of you who are online with us tonight already know, are very concerned about the environment, very concerned about the health of our forests, our own health of those who live here. So it was, it's pretty easy to imagine that, well, it's pretty, I'm sorry, there's people in the waiting room. Let me quick let them in.
I get it.
So it's pretty easy to imagine that when you put the call out and say, we need volunteers to help with a problem, that you're going to see volunteers show up. So when Rachel began the stakeholder meetings, the Watershed Partnership meetings, it became pretty obvious that while it seems like a large problem for the entire watershed, maybe if you break it down into smaller segments, areas that towns and communities can handle, that it might be a little bit easier to deal with it. So that's what we did here. We started talking to volunteers and potential volunteers in informal discussion groups at parks throughout the township. We made it a point to visit at least every village in the township once. Some we visited more, so that people who really wanted to find out what was going on could get answers directly. They could ask their questions, they could get answers directly. And that started a flow of volunteers into the program. And I'll admit to you, it hasn't been an easy program. We all are dealing with COVID, and as Paul alluded to earlier in the program before we actually got started, these markers that we started to put out to raise awareness about the fact that things that go into the storm drains end up in our waterways need at least 3 dry days ahead, so that the concrete we're installing these on is completely dry. And then hopefully at least a couple of days in the forecast afterwards that there would not be any significant rain, so that the adhesive can cure. So we talked about the problems with bacteria. We talked about some of the low dissolved oxygen and other problems that are in the waterways, excess nutrients, and asked people to sign up, take some markers, take a map, and go start installing. Well, we're doing well. We would do much better if we could find those 5-6 day dry windows of time, but we're doing well. We've had well over 100 folks who have expressed an interest. 72 individuals have actually gotten out there and started doing work. So far in this past year, we've put in 815 hours. The numbers of markers installed, and I'll get to the door hangers in a minute, is a little bit of a number in flux, because there are still quite a number of markers out that I haven't gotten the actual reports on, but I'm verifying that at least 1,860 storm drains have markers on them now, but I believe that the real number has well topped 2,000. And that means we only have 12,000 more storm drains to mark. So there's a lot of work to do. We hope that if you're listening to this, you might have an interest in helping out. As storm drains get marked, we follow up with volunteers who then take our informational door hangers out and hang them in the neighborhoods following the storm marker installation, because the door hangers reference the storm drain markers, but they also expand the message beyond just the bacterial level. It talks about pet waste, yard waste, and lawn chemicals, some of the problems we have in our waterways as a result. And I find that it's terrific that volunteers will say, well, just give me a small map with a few drains to mark, and the doors around that neighborhood. And then 2 weeks later, they're back and say, can I do more? So that's the nature of our community. When there's a problem, people get together, work together, and solve problems. And the work that we're doing it's about so much more than just knowing what the problem is. This translates into actually doing something about it. And so we've gotten off to a really good start. If you're interested in volunteering, there's a QR code, and I'm going to repeat it on the next slide for you to see, or you can send me an email if you have questions and want to talk about it more. But let's see if I can make this advance there. So there's a image of the door hanger with some of the information that's on it. Our community relations department did a lovely job of creating this. There's more information on the back of it that breaks it down into those 3 categories of problems. But we've set more dates to go out and meet people where they live, right in their neighborhood, at a neighborhood park or at a dog park. So here are dates that are already on the calendar, and there are more being set all the time. The times that will be there, it's the same thing. We'll talk about what the issues are. We'll invite people to ask their questions and give them answers. We'll invite them to follow up if they're interested, to sign up as volunteers. And in addition to now offering the opportunities to put drain markers down, as you see in the illustration on the door hanger there, or to follow up that with putting door hangers out on the doors, thanks in great part to H-GAC. We also now have some pet waste bag dispensers, and I've ordered carabiners that say bag it and trash it. And there's an informational piece I've attached to that. So we're putting the pet waste bag dispensers onto the carabiners. And at these dog park events, I'm trying to recruit some new volunteers, especially youth groups, high school groups, and civic groups, adult organizations as well, to consider coming out on these dates. And while we're talking about what some of the issues are and answering those questions, those, especially if they're younger groups that are helping, will be giving any of the dog owners who show up for this or who are walking in the park around the area while we're there, to give them the information piece with the carabiner and the pet waste bag dispenser on it. Had a chance to try this out as a little bit of a pilot program at one of the dog park events, at one of the neighborhood park events a couple of months ago, and a group of young Girl Scouts, they were like 3rd grade level girls, 6 of them showed up to help with this. So I spent a few minutes with them, kind of coaching them on some of the things that they might say to dog owners. And I was amazed at the response. I mean, these small girls would go up to someone with a dog and say, "May I please give you one of these?" And they'd hold the carabiner up. "May I please give you one of these?" And they would say, "You could put this on the handle of your dog's leash, and it would be great to carry your dog's poop home. In fact," they would say, "in fact, if you put it on the handle of the leash, the dog can carry his own poop home." And so, people would laugh, but say, "Yes, I'll take one." And most of them at that event that day hooked it right onto their dog's leash and walked around with it, which I was thrilled and pleased to see, because they were modeling the behavior we were trying to get people to adopt. So it was terrific that these youth were interested in getting involved. And I hope that if you're not able to help yourself, you'll tell others about ways right here in our community that they can help spread the word. Number one, raise awareness that there is a problem. But number two, do something about it. And if all they do is make sure that they pick up their own dog's poop and put it into the trash, rather than leaving it behind either on the ground or even leaving it behind in a bag, which is one of the problems we have here, is People bag their dog's poop and then toss it into the tree line. I guess they're waiting for the pet waste fairy to come along and pick it up, but we haven't seen her yet. So get involved in some way, help out in some way, either tell someone or participate yourself. And again, if you're interested in volunteering yourself, take out your phone right now, flash that QR code, go to the registration form, sign up. All of these dates are on that form. If you only want to help at one of these neighborhood and dog park events that's listed here, do that. They're all listed on that form. So, Paul, does anyone have questions for me?
I don't see anything. I would now people that haven't seen you before realize why you're called a volunteer magnet. You know, and that's what we need. I think just to follow up that again, we haven't really stressed it, but dog waste is a big part of the problem. And what we're doing here, what Teri's doing, and trying to make people aware of the fact that a lot of people don't really put it together that those storm drains go to Spring Creek and it all ends up in Galveston Bay, and that it's incumbent upon us to try to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think one thing I've learned over the years is that I really don't think people do a lot of the things that they do because they just want to be mean. I think a lot of the things that happen is that they're not aware of the fact that this is the result of their action. They're not aware that these go to the creek. They're not aware that the creek goes to Lake Houston and then on to Galveston Bay. They're just not aware. And I think that our job is in part to just convince people and let them know that we have
So Paul, I wanted to give a shout out to Woodlands Green as an organization. Some of you who are watching this may already know that back on the 15th of January, Woodlands Green members organized a day down in Creekside Park Village at Tiburon Park. And we spent about 2.5 hours installing down there. 14 volunteers showed up. If you think back to January 15th, it was super cold that morning. The day started out well below freezing. The wind was gusting at 40 miles an hour. And this group of 14 volunteers, I mean, talk about diehards. They showed up, they worked the morning. That one event, we put out a little over 150 markers and well over 300 door hangers that morning. Some of our younger Woodlands Green members, some of the student ambassadors, were really helpful and instrumental. For 3 members and 1 other student showed up, and they spent a total of something like 2.5, 3 hours. I'm sorry, 1.5 or 2 hours among themselves each, that they hung those door hangers neighborhood after neighborhood. So that turned out to be a really wonderful event for Woodlands Green members to participate in. We're working on another date to do that again. So once again, if you're a Woodlands Green member that's on this call, sign up to volunteer. And if you've already signed up, thank you. We're getting there. We're working our way through this now. We expect a little bit better weather break and have kind of given up on waiting for good weather to start people out there working. We're just setting dates and we're going to make something else happen.
So I was one of Teri's January 15th volunteers, and she makes it so easy in terms of providing supply kits for us. And even though it was very, very cold, I just want to give kudos to Teri. She made it very easy for us, outline maps. I think I only gave an hour, hour and a half that day of time, but we were able to cover quite a bit of ground, and she had it all planned out for us. So Can't thank you enough, Teri.
Here, we have another in the chat about a video on what storm
Hey,
drain
Cam.
marking.
Did you do
Yeah.
the sheets, your case?
Brian,
Washing this, the dryer.
did you see it, hear that, Terry?
A video about how to install them?
Well, I think it's actually Carolyn Newman asked about it, but the video on what storm drain markings, how to.
Yes, so once you sign up to volunteer, as part of my response to you, I will send you the link to watch the YouTube, the Environmental Services Channel YouTube video on how to do the installation. It's only a 3-minute video, and it's very clear about what it takes to install the storm drain markers, if that would be what you would